The Zero Hedge debate series. Today we will be discussing immigration with David Beer of the Cato Institute. Mr. Beer, where is the best place for people to find your collection of research on this topic?
Cato.org, the Cato Institute website.
We also have Simon Hankinson from the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Hankinson, where is the best place for people to find your research on this topic?
Heritage.org also has a lot of my stuff, or Google.
Sounds good. Simon, what metrics do you use to determine whether or not immigration is a net benefit or net cost to the United States?
Well, the basic metric is, does it make America safer, more prosperous, stronger? Is it good for the country? And you can look at various studies. Cato just did one. The Center for Immigration Studies, Federation for American Immigration Reform, Manhattan Institute. Everybody has their agenda when you go into it. But at the end of the day, it seems pretty clear that younger, educated people add to the Treasury over their lifetime, and sicker, older, or less educated people take away over their lifetime by various amounts. But all the studies seem to pretty much agree on that. So if it was just about money, then we should take half the population of Washington, D.C. that's on Medicaid and ship them to Bangladesh, pay the Bangladeshis, peanuts to take care of them, and then ship over 300,000 Bangladeshi workers to do the jobs, and we'd be better off. But to me, there's more to being an Englishman than just physical presence. And the same with Americans or French or Dutch or Prussians, if you're a Gilbert and Sullivan fan. There's something else to a nation. There's some other quality that matters, and humans are not just work units. If we don't care if it's Gustav or Jerry or Carlos or Charlie or Mohammed or Melvin, it's just how many widgets can you make in a day, how many cars can you make in a week. We don't care if you know the language, the culture, the history, if you love the country, if you'd fight for it, if you'd send your kids to fight for it, or if you'd volunteer for the fire department. If none of that matters, if we're just labor units, then we should have unlimited immigration. And there should be a free market, which is essentially the position I believe that David's going to argue. But my position is that the metrics should count more than just pure dollars and cents at the end of the day.
Mr. Beer, what metrics do you use to determine whether or not immigration is a net benefit or net cost to the United States?
Look, as a libertarian, my principle is it in... does it expand individual liberty? Does it impose on the rights of individuals in the United States? Does it violate my right to life, liberty, and property? If it does, then the government should intervene to prevent that from happening, protect my rights. That's the role of the government in our society as laid out in the Declaration of Independence, and it's sort of the founding principle, organizing principle of the Constitution. And so when I look at immigration, I see a lot of people who come here and associate and contract and trade with Americans on a voluntary basis. And as long as it's voluntary, as long as people are coming for peaceful purposes and want to live and work and otherwise contribute to our society in a legal way, then they should be allowed to do so, and it should be legal for them to do so. And so that's the basic framework that I have, is one of individual rights. My right to marry someone and live with them here in the United States is none of the government's concern. The same for if I want to hire someone or be employed by someone or buy from someone or sell my home or rent my home or whatever other actions that we might want to take. As long as it's voluntary, that means it's mutually beneficial. It's between consenting parties. There's a mutually beneficial interaction there that we recognize in the rest of the world. In all of our other, interactions, we kind of recognize this principle. But in immigration is the one area that we've sort of cornered off and say we're not going to apply this presumption in favor of liberty. And so, yes, if someone's coming here to harm our country and violate our rights, then yeah, that's a role for the government to intervene. But otherwise, the government should stay out of it and let Americans be the ones to set immigration policy rather than a bunch of bureaucrats who think they know more than you or I do about our own lives. And so that's the sort of fundamental premise of what I think about when I think about is something good or bad for the country. It's not in dollar terms. It's in terms of our rights and our liberties. And when you think about the flip side of it, well, if it's true that as it's sometimes said, the government owns the United States, which is a complete repudiation, ahistorical view of the history of the United States, and the Constitution directly repudiates it. The government does not own the United States. It's not the owner of the country. And so if you adopt that view, then that really is the path to totalitarianism. Because if the government is the owner of the country, then it can really dictate any rules it wants. It could, of course, deport Americans to a foreign country because that's in the interest of the United States, however defined. And so I do think it's problematic where you adopt a principle that you wouldn't adopt in any other sphere in the immigration space. And my view is we should instead apply the same principles that we adopt anywhere else to the immigration policy of the United States.
Mr. Hankinson, how do you respond to David's claim we should have a general presumption of liberty first in general and then not have double standards for the sphere of immigration between countries?
Yeah, well, if you go by that philosophy, if I could sell my daughter into prostitution and make money off it, why shouldn't I do that? Doesn't hurt you. No problem. Children are excellent workers down mines, in places where you need small hands, some kind of factory work. And there's no reason to educate them all because in New York City right now, I was just reading in New York State, only about 25% of kids can do math at grade level, and only about a third of them can read and write. So we could send them down the mines and put them in the factories. And why should anyone really disturb my right to do that? And then last time I debated David, we were in the Walter E. Washington Convention Center. And I asked him, would it be okay, according to your philosophy, if I fired everybody in this convention center and went to Bangladesh, for example, or Burkina Faso, or Belgium, although the Belgians are more expensive. And I said, I'm going to pay them $5 an hour. They're going to man the food stands, and they're going to be the security guards and do the technical work and run the center. Let's say there's 300 employees there. I have no idea. And he said, yeah, but they'd all get better jobs. Well, the thing about libertarian philosophy, which I've always admired as an intellectual exercise, is that in the real world, it doesn't work because it assumes that everybody is acting rationally and honestly and decently. And that's not how people behave. So, for example, if you take a 50-year-old woman with diabetes who works at a food counter in Washington, D.C. at the convention center, who's got a special needs kid and takes care of her mom and 2 other kids, is she really just going to be able to find a better job right away? But let's say she goes back to nursing school and learns to be a nurse, and she gets a job as a nurse and makes more money. Well, we can replace her with a nurse from Nigeria. So then she has to go out and get another job. Or what about a security guard? Let's say he's got 10 years experience. He's got his hourly wage up a little bit. We could fire him and replace him with a guy from Ghana, say, who'd do the work for half the money. Well, what's he going to do? Maybe he's going to go learn to be a mechanic. And he does that for 2 years, gets a job as a mechanic, making $45 an hour. But we could replace him with a mechanic from Madagascar who makes $15 an hour, $5 an hour. So, yeah, if you're only talking about human beings as robots, then absolutely that philosophy works. But if you bring morality into it and humanity and reality, then very quickly it breaks down. And so you do need to have rules that put the rights of children first, that put families first, and that frankly put Americans ahead of people in other countries who have nothing to do with us and to whom we owe absolutely nothing.
David, do people have a unique obligation to the people first in their family? You were accused of wanting Simon's daughter to work in the mines with her very small hands. First to their family, state, and country, meaning they have a higher obligation to people in closer proximity than they do to people in distant lands and other cultures, creating a constant insecurity that I can't just settle down and enjoy life. I have to constantly be competing to please consumer demand. How do you respond to that mindset?
I basically agree with it. I think we do have more of an obligation to our family and more an obligation to our neighbors than we do to other people. But just because I have more of an obligation to my family doesn't mean I can, take Simon's kid and sell him into slavery because it's going to benefit my kid. So the fundamental rule here is you don't violate the rights of other people to live their lives peacefully. Yes, you should protect your family, support your family, do whatever you need to do to help your neighbors and your community, except for doing things that violate the rights of other people to live their lives peacefully, including those of your neighbors. My neighbor is someone who's a U.S. citizen who's trying to marry someone in one of these countries that the Trump administration has just banned from coming here. And so, yes, immigration policy should be seen in light of the rights of our community, of our society. And when you have immigration policies set by people who don't care about the rights of Americans, they don't care about the rights of individuals to live freely in this country, then you end up with what we're seeing now in the United States, where you have a papers, please society, where you have rogue government agents demanding to see your papers and detaining you if you can't prove your right to stay here, where you have people who are going through the legal immigration process, who are married to U.S. citizens, being arrested, detained, and deported to horrible conditions abroad. This really, at its base, I think it's a total misdirection, total confusion of the issue to talk about this in terms of the rights of foreigners and the right to come and do what. No, it's our rights who are being impacted by this. It's our prosperity and our safety and freedom that's going to be negatively impacted when we adopt this philosophy that says we don't have a right to associate and contract and trade with people who happen to be born in other countries. And the whole idea of, selling kids and all this, it's just a nonsensical attack on libertarianism. Libertarians believe that look, we hear more about parent rights from conservatives and not having the government intrude into their, what they want to do with their kids than from anyone. So I don't, I think it's kind of a fallacious misdirection. We believe that kids have rights that should be protected by the government from people who would try to coerce them into wrong behavior. But this really has nothing to do with immigration policy. On immigration policy, our position is that protecting our rights to associate, contract, and trade will make our lives better. And that is manifestly true. The free market produces all of the benefits that we're seeing in society. Allowing markets to work produces more wealth. Allowing people to come here, allowing us to purchase products produced in other countries increases our prosperity, because that is how the engine of wealth creation is created since Adam Smith. Obviously even before that, but Adam Smith was the first one to kind of lay down what is the origin of wealth. The origin of wealth is in the specialization of labor. Through trade, we produce more for others. And so I really just think we're just getting in these weird hypotheticals. And he says in the real world, when he comes up with all of these hypothetical manufactured scenarios, when we know actually we have a whole tradition in the United States of having free immigration, where people came legally to the United States in huge numbers, way larger than we allow legally to immigrate today. And it produced the Industrial Revolution and the greatest and strongest society we've ever seen.
That's
right,
why
Simon.
I asked if there were time limits, because that was a great filibuster, but there are just so many different directions that he's going in that it's kind of hard to get a hold of one. But I guess you could pick where you want to go from there.
So let's take you responded to the creation of wealth concept. When it comes to, let's say that I am a nationalist and I just care about America, Simon, does it necessarily follow that I want the state telling Americans who they can and can't associate with? Couldn't I take the position that I'm a nationalist, and that's why I don't think the state should be telling us Americans who we could voluntarily trade with, who we could sell houses to, who we can hire, because that disempowers America from the opportunity to trade freely? Couldn't the support for nationalism be taken to a different conclusion? Couldn't you have the same presumption you care about the nation and still not support immigration controls? Or is allowing for immigration inherently meaning that you're not a nationalist and you don't care about the nation?
Well, I think those are extremes, like no immigration versus open borders. I don't think that's the argument here. I think David does believe in open borders, and as you say, free exchange. Basically, if I wanted to go to a Ford factory in Michigan, let's assume there's still one there, and I wanted to fire every American worker, and I wanted to replace them with workers I could hire in Pakistan for, say, 20% of the money. No health benefits. I create a tent city for them. I don't know about David, but I've actually lived in developing countries. I've lived in 8 countries. I've been to 80. And I can tell you, I could find those workers for you. I could replace the Ford factory workers with people from Pakistan and probably 100 other countries. So in the scenario that I believe, and I'm sorry, David, I'm going to do a hypothetical here, so bear with me. In that scenario, why shouldn't I be able to do that? I should be allowed to fire Americans. The hospital here, GW, it has a lot of very expensive nurses and doctors and specialists, and I'm pretty sure I could go to Bangkok and replace at least half of them for significantly less money. So why shouldn't I do that? So yeah, if your philosophy is that there should be no barriers between commerce, as long as everybody's okay with it, then a child should be allowed to work down a mine if they want to. Why should I stop them? It's their choice. I'm not making David's kids do it. I'm just saying if a child wants to do that, they should be able to do that. So what we're really talking here is the difference between open borders and basically free trade with no limits and controlled borders where we get to set those limits. No one is stopping you from associating with foreigners. No one is stopping you from visiting other countries. Most foreigners who want to visit the United States and can qualify for a visa can come. People who are going to come here on a visa saying they're going to go to Disneyland and then go get a job can't come because they will become illegal immigrants. So, I mean, the philosophy here seems to be between these two extremes. And I would say that if you were allowed to sell your house to anybody in the world, regardless of whether they had the right to come here, then obviously they would have the right to come here under that system. And you would very swiftly see people like David would be perfectly well off because they're not coming for his job right away. He'll be able to retire. But his children and their children will be competing with countries where the prevailing wage is substantially lower than ours and where the level of corruption is monumentally higher. And believe me, they won't be able to compete on those terms.
All right, Simon, let's try different hypotheticals outside the realm of immigration to see if the concept of hypotheticals is reliable for us to come to an accurate conclusion. Simon, as of today, my girlfriend could break up with me and leave me for any other guy for any other reason, leave me heartbroken. This could lead me into depression, and I could commit suicide. All the customers of my business could stop shopping with me and start going to a competitor if they so choose. This could leave me devastated, heartbroken, and I'd have to send my kids into the mines. People could stop watching my YouTube channel, and I would get no attention on the Libertarian Institute that I run. This would leave me homeless, maybe even depressed. This would be horrible. Is the fear that people could disassociate with you an accurate way to determine whether or not people should have the right to immigrate, considering these devastating hypotheticals could be applied in almost any circumstance?
You lost me somewhere along the way there because you said this wasn't about immigration. This was an analogy about something completely different. So I'm not sure what you're driving at.
You said really, really bad things could happen under the principle of free association when it comes to immigration.
No.
I'm saying all those bad things can happen in many other aspects of society, and as devastating as it is that my girlfriend could leave me, people could stop watching my channel, and my customers could stop shopping with me, The answer is kind of, well, tough luck. Yes, you do have to compete. Those bad things could happen, but we should still have a presumption of freedom in our everyday life and when it comes to immigration. That is my point.
I think the presumption starts with freedom, freedom of speech. But there are even limits on freedom of speech. I can't go out there in the middle of the public square and call for the murder of you because I don't like your political beliefs. Am I right? Okay. So there are limits.
Well, I don't know, because Lindsey Graham can go around advocating mass murder in other countries and he doesn't get arrested. So I actually don't know what the law is on free speech. I wish there was a consistent principle that they could tell us.
That is pretty much the case law, is that there are certain limits to free speech. It's not crying fire in a crowded theater. That's a myth. But you cannot call for the violent overthrow of the United States government. You cannot call for the specific act of violence against a particular individual. You can say, I think we should, I don't know, invade such and such a country. That's a different thing entirely. But there always have to be limits on what human beings do. And I've always said, look, I've had some friends in the past who are libertarians, and they're super smart people. And if everybody was like them, then I think we could all have bazookas and tanks in our front yard, and we could all have access to all the hardcore drugs we want, because those people would probably behave responsibly with those potentials. But sadly, I've lived in the world. I've had 23 jobs. I've driven a night shift cab, and I've seen that not all human beings are responsible and make good choices. And so you do have to have some ground rules, and immigration is one of those things. We don't have zero immigration, but we don't have open borders. I think both of those would be bad. And so we have to, split the baby and have something in the middle, and no one's ever happy about it. We fought about this for my entire working life. I'll never get everything I want, and I can assure you David will never get everything he wants. So here we are batting the ping pong ball back and forth.
If I could just say one thing about the wage point, because it's come up a couple of times now, and it really reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of why the United States has high incomes. Why are we so prosperous in the United States and these other countries are so poor? And it has nothing to do with the supply of labor. It's not because the United States has so few workers and we've really constrained the labor supply to the point where now we're prosperous. No, we are prosperous in this country because the workers who came here or who were born here and grew up here are so much more productive than people in Haiti or wherever else. It has nothing to do with the number of people. More people does not reduce your standard of living. If that was true, then the quadrupling in the labor supply over the last 100 years would have ate out all of us, and we'd all be eating each other's, I don't know, whatever, or out of the toilet or something. I mean, this is a total misunderstanding of the economics and how markets work. And the reason why you don't have, mass layoffs whenever there's an increase in the supply of labor is because people are paid based on their productivity. And so it doesn't make sense to hire someone at, I hire someone at a wage below their productivity, then they just go to someone else, another employer who pays them the wage that actually matches how productive they are. And so there's no mass layoffs, and this whole turmoil that you see in markets doesn't play out because that's not how wages are set. Wages are not set based on, I have a bunch of people over here and I can move them here. No, it's based on how productive people are. People are more productive here because we have more capital, more technology, which have developed over time, and having more people come here does not reduce wages or our standard of living. Having a higher labor supply doesn't reduce our standard of living. And if you look at the fastest labor growth we've had in the last 70 years was during the post-World War II period, where you had women entering the labor force, you had the baby boom, you had all the workers coming back from the war, led to this huge boom in the economy and the fastest wage growth we've had really since, over the last 100 years. And so it's just a total inaccuracy to make this claim.
Simon, do you think the average American worker should have economic insecurity when it comes to the immigration claim? Do you think if we increased immigration, kept it at its current levels, decreased it, or completely ceased immigration, what effect do you think that would have on the American worker if you're just looking at it through that lens? I'm sorry, Simon. How should the average American worker perceive the costs and benefits of immigration?
I think the average American worker has been shafted by mass immigration in the Western world in the last generation. I mean, all of the academic theories and all of the data don't explain what it's like for the 25% of American men who only have a high school education who are out of the workforce. In 1965, it was about 7% of that same subset. So what are these guys doing? They're probably doing some work under the table. They're watching a lot of daytime. They're probably claiming a bunch of different benefits that the government has, like 80 different kinds of welfare benefits that are out there. So that's a direct impact. I thought we were going to talk about H-1Bs today, so I did a little preparation on that. I wrote a paper about that pretty recently. There's a very specific example of a visa where you bring in cheap labor from overseas and Americans lose their jobs. In many cases, they actually have to train the people that are taking their jobs. Why? Because those workers earn less money. If you're an American computer science graduate with a PhD, say, you might have borrowed $200,000 to get to that point. If you're an Indian, you only probably borrowed $10,000, if anything, more likely nothing. So you're competing at a completely different level. You don't have debt to pay off, and so you can probably take a salary of $60,000 a year instead of the prevailing wage of $90,000 or $100,000. And because of all the weaknesses in the H-1B, it's possible for companies to do that. So every year we have 200,000 students who get hired with a competitive advantage over Americans because their employers don't have to pay the payroll taxes. And you have another 400,000 H-1Bs that are either hired or renewed that are also competing unfairly against American workers. So in some cases, if you're talking about an '01 opera singer coming to perform at the Met, and there's no American that can sing like she can, it doesn't affect the labor market much at all. But if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of so-called skilled workers who are competing on unfair terms against Americans, then it massively affects them. If you can ship jobs from the United States overseas, and then the Americans used to work in, say, factories are ending up working in retail for half the money, it does impact their lives and makes their lives worse.
David, we've discussed the economic concept extensively. I want to go to, say, consider this. If I am someone living in Palestine in 1897, and we start having an increase of Jewish immigration year after year after year, almost all of those people are genuinely hard workers in search of a better life, a lot of them fleeing oppression, coming to my country and improving the standard of living. But once there are so many of them by 1948, they're now able to harness a political power at my expense and now use the political system against me and oppress me as a new minority in a land that my family has been in for thousands, hundreds of years. So in that case, should we fear that mass immigration could lead to a point where people with the best of intentions come in, and then after a certain threshold is reached, we could become victims and have the very freedoms you value violated because this new group, who does not have an allegiance to the new country they're in, nor to the people in that country, couldn't that then subject us to even worse perils than the ones of strict immigration controls?
It's entirely possible, and it's worth the theory. It works in theory, and so it's something that we've subjected to quite rigorous study. My colleague Alex Narasta has written an entire book called Wretched Refuse that looks in this question, looks at Israel, looks at Jordan and a number of other countries where you've had this mass influx of immigrants in a certain area. What effect did it have on economic freedom in Israel or Jordan or in the United States, looking between states? Is it true that there's some deterioration either in the quality of the economic institutions, economic freedom, an increase in corruption, a lot of different types of measures that you could look at, and really uniformly we don't find that this effect has been borne out. There is assimilation, there's self-selection even before people get here. People who are most favorable to freedom and liberal democracies are the ones who tend to move to freedom and liberal democracies. So when you look at, for example, the Muslim population in the United States, they have political opinions that are wildly divergent. They basically look like on gay rights like an evangelical Christian in the United States compared to, in Saudi Arabia, where 99% of the population thinks that it should be illegal to even be gay, let alone marry legally and with state sanction. So there is assimilation, there's pre-assimilation. You look historically, when was the greatest growth in government? When was the expansion in the welfare state and the regulatory state? It happened when immigration was at its lowest point in the 1930s. The 1960s, during the Great Society, we had the lowest share of the foreign-born population in the history of the United States. And again, this was when you had this huge growth in government. As a result of that, it sort of plateaued actually and stopped growing nearly as quickly after we had this big increase in immigration in the 1990s. So I don't see any evidence that this phenomenon is happening. I see kind of the opposite happening, where the institutions were most under attack when immigration was low.
Okay, but in the case of America, the natives did bear a very large negative cost to massive European immigration. In Palestine, a lot of Palestinians suffered from a lot of Jewish immigration over time. So I think, doesn't Narashta use the example of Soviet immigration into Israel as opposed to Jewish immigration into Palestine, which took place previously? Couldn't a large number of people coming in and controlling the political system be wielded as a tool against the domestic population? Isn't this something we should actually fear?
No, not really. I mean, naturalized citizens are about 7% of the population. Even if I had my way and immigration was double, it's a marginal effect. They assimilate rapidly. We look at a lot of different survey evidence on this. A general social survey bears this out. Their political opinions really aren't that different. In fact, they're not statistically significantly different on almost any policy question except for immigration and what should happen to people in the United States and whether immigrants should have rights here. So for the vast majority of the immigrant population, there's assimilation just by time of naturalization. And even after that, you go into the second generation, they look indistinguishable from the U.S.-born population. So I don't see it happening. Our institutions are popular and successful for a reason, and it's because they produce so much prosperity. They solve real problems. Liberal or libertarian institutions prevent conflict. They prevent, social warring. And that's a solution that people are going to keep coming back to again and again, regardless of whether immigrants come here or not. And so the Constitution has held, and I think the greatest attacks on the Constitution right now aren't coming from the immigrant cohort, but from the nationalists who want to turn us into an authoritarian dystopia right now.
Simon, is part of your immigration analysis a fear that with so many people in the world who don't speak the language that we do, who maybe don't have the presumption of liberty in their cultures, they came here, wouldn't they bring those ideas here? Is part of your analysis, Simon, that we could become a hated, oppressed minority in the country we grew up in?
Yeah, I think that's it's we've seen it in European countries, and I think it's a very distinct possibility in the United States. One, if you bring people from low trust countries where, for example, there's very high corruption, high fraud, and I've worked in those countries, West Africa, parts of Asia. There are many, many countries where the central government is weak. The police are corrupt. You have to bribe your way to get exams, to get into school, to get a job. You cannot expect people to come here and on day one jettison all of that and just become Quakers or Puritans. It doesn't work that way. It takes generations. In the 18th century, Great Britain was incredibly corrupt. It took them 100 years to get through that to the point where they considered public corruption to be wrong, and they punished it. The United States also was much more corrupt in the 18th century than we are today. But it's not something you can take for granted. So in the case of the Somalis in Minnesota, for example, they're behaving in a way that's very typical of the way they would behave at home, but that's atypical for the state of Minnesota. So one would hope that in a generation or two or three, they will assimilate and become much more like the standard of the state in which they reside, where fraud is fairly low. Otherwise, our system will crack. You can go to parts of Great Britain these days where there are no pubs anymore because people don't drink, where they don't like you to take your dog for a walk because Muslims in particular don't like dogs. There was an article the other day about the countryside being too white because the cities are where the immigrants concentrate, and they're saying that you got to make the countryside friendlier for people of color, as if somehow there was any rule saying they couldn't go. I mean, they're free to buy houses, they're free to go for walks, they're free to do everything everybody else is. But one of the ideas was, well, we have to make sure that there aren't so many dogs around in the countryside, or animals that they're uncomfortable with. So yeah, if you bring in a large number of people who have very different social expectations, they will want to change the system. I think that's normal, that's natural. In the same way that, the Amish community in the United States is very different from the surrounding counties in Pennsylvania and Ohio and so on. The Hasidic Jewish community in New York, or Kiryas Joel, is very different from the surrounding communities. They have different rules. If you achieve a majority, then you can have your way. You can have your call to prayer, for example. Instead of bells on Sunday, you have a call to prayer 5 times a day out of the Muezzin. That's a normal thing. Segregated swimming pools and gyms and classes is something people in Europe are pushing for who come from countries where that's a normal thing. Now, I think they have every right to do that in their home countries, and they have every right to live in their society any way they want. But yeah, I don't want to live in a multicultural society where I have to change my behavior and my rules and my traditions, particularly in a country that my ancestors have lived in for 1,000 or more years, because of people who are coming and importing their own values and systems.
So, David, please respond to the mindset that if we import the third world, we will become the third world, a genuine fear that a lot of Americans have. Please address that.
No, I mean, just historically, it isn't true. We have sticky institutions in the United States. We have a strong constitution. We have these founding principles that are attractive to the people who come here. They're attractive even before they get here. We're not getting a random sampling of the world. We're getting people who are most interested in the free markets and freedom, and even the people who don't even really understand what they're getting into learn to understand this system and understand what it's like to live in a society with free speech. I mean, we can talk about Hasidic Jews and the Amish and, exceptions to the general rule. But look, our society is one founded by the English in the 18th century. And those rules and those principles have largely guided the United States for, 250 years. And there's a reason for that, despite huge waves of immigration. I mean, I think the people who look back in the 19th and early 20th century just don't have any concept of what Europe was like. I mean, Italy was a tyrannical country. This was not a free society that people were coming from, where they understood, had a long tradition of freedom and elections and democracy. And you listen to what the popes were putting out. in the 19th century, it was condemnations of freedom of religion and liberal democracy and all of the things that America stood for. And rather than having all the Catholics who came here change the United States, it was the exact opposite. The American Catholics changed the Catholic Church's position on these issues in the 1960s. And that, to me, demonstrates that, look, our society is robust against, these, purported threats from, foreign ideologies and so on. It's not foreign ideologies that have a bunch of masked men wearing predator masks on the street demanding to see my papers. That, well, certainly not me because I'm white, but the Hispanic construction worker is, and it doesn't matter if he's a citizen or not, they're still demanding his papers. And so this situation in the United States where we have a president who tried to overthrow an election, that's a fundamental core part of our democracy, has nothing to do with immigrants. It wasn't immigrants storming the Capitol on January 6th. It's not immigrants who are arresting people for writing op-eds in student newspapers. This is something that is being pushed by nativist Americans. They want to call themselves heritage Americans. In Simon's case, he's not a heritage American, but he's a heritage employee, so maybe he gets put in there. But at the end of the day, the repudiation of the First Amendment, look, the Second Amendment's under assault by this administration, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, you go down the list. I mean, this administration is the most hostile to constitutional democracy in my lifetime, certainly, and it has nothing to do with immigrants. They're not the ones destroying our institutions. It's being led by a group of people in the pursuit of a nativist goal.
Simon, do you think the welfare state creates maybe a moral hazard in attracting undesirable types of immigrants that we might not want? So if, we have a problem with immigrants coming and abusing the welfare system, well, shouldn't we then move toward a voluntary mutual aid sort of assistance program? This way people could at least opt out of it. Simon, do you think the welfare state attracts the undesirable immigrants that we have a problem with?
I will answer that question. I just want to have a minute to respond to the bit of the soapbox derby there. I didn't think we were going to debate the Trump administration and all the usual January 6th fascist agents and so on. But look, what you have to remember, David is extrapolating from hundreds of years of history where we were bringing people in from Europe and we had no welfare state. Now we're bringing in people from the third world, essentially, Asia, Africa, poor countries, and we have a massive, generous welfare state, which is easy to fleece. And we no longer have a majority of people, it seems, who actually believe in this country and its values and their ability to kind of turn everyone into Americans. You bring people like Mamdani in, who come with a socialist agenda and don't like capitalism, you're going to find that it changes cities like New York, where overwhelmingly immigrants voted for him, people who are not natives to New York, even if they're from other states, and native New Yorkers voted against him. On welfare, you'll be surprised to hear that is one of the rare things that David and I agree on. We have had debates many times, and we always come back to that point. You cannot have open borders and a welfare state. And where I go with that is, I know that Congress is incapable of ever getting rid of the welfare state. It's not going to happen. It's a ratchet. So we cannot have open borders. Where David goes is, well, let's have open borders and then worry about the welfare state later. But as I said before, all of the reports that I have read, there's much better research in Europe because they have better statistics. But people from certain countries never contribute in their entire lives to the fiscal balance. In other words, most people, most native Danes, for example, or Finns or Dutch or Germans, in their lifetime, they take money out when they're young for public schools and so on, and they take money out when they're old from pensions and healthcare. But in the middle years, they put a lot of money in taxes. And then if they happen to pop their cork at 50, well, then that's a great net benefit for the state. But by and large, natives are a benefit. People from the Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, there's a list of countries, never even get up to that zero mark where they're putting in as much money as they take out. People from Japan, the United States, Australia who immigrate, and there's very few of them who immigrate to those countries, have a similar arc to natives. In the United States, we have in the last 4 years with our open borders not been selectively importing people based on their skills or their abilities. We've been basically letting in everybody. And our refugee program typically brings people in from countries where they fit the other profile. So during their whole lives, they're not going to contribute more than they take out. So yes, I do very much fear that if we simply assume that all immigrants are the same, whether they come from India and have a rocket science degree, or they come from Pakistan and never got past middle school, just because they may look alike and be ethnically similar, it does not mean that they are going to contribute to the United States in the same way. And our immigration system right now worries more about family unification, meaning if one person is in the U.S., all 85 of the extended family should be here to unify, than they do about skills-based migration. And that's probably somewhere David and I might also agree, if there were any limits, and I know he doesn't want any, he would probably prefer that we bring more people in based on their skills and their ability to contribute than the mere fact of a blood relation to someone who's already here.
So, David, if we agree that the welfare state is undesirable, however, it seems rather insurmountable at this time to get the socialist right wing and the socialist left wing to ever address the concept of a welfare state. Are we only left with defending ourselves by stopping immigration in order to, stop a total welfare state takeover? Please address that, along with the example of Mamdani, an immigrant who is coming here to be an imperialist against Americans, using political power at the expense of the rest of us.
Yeah, so just to look at the point of the fiscal effects of immigration, look, overall, immigrants are very positive for the United States fiscally. They do pay more in taxes than they receive in benefits. Even if you look at low-skilled immigrants, they generally pay more in taxes than they receive in benefits. And if you compare those people, the most important comparison here is not to the baseline of zero. The baseline of zero is ancient history for the United States. The baseline is a negative $2 trillion deficit for the United States. So the average person in the United States is going negative and going fast. So if you are reducing your debt to GDP, that is the relevant metric for whether someone is improving the fiscal balance of the United States or harming it. Is the population who we've let in from abroad, is that population increasing the size of the economy more than they're increasing the debt? And not only are they doing that, they're actually reducing the debt, but even the lower skilled populations that are net negative in terms of their fiscal flows are still expanding the size of the economy large enough that they're still reducing our debt to GDP, which of course our debt to GDP is at an astronomical negative level. So it's very difficult to find an immigrant group that is as bad as our current fiscal environment is. I know it's a nuanced point. It's not one that you're going to hear a lot because it takes more than 2 seconds to explain it to someone. But that is the relevant metric. Our report that we released this week goes exhaustively into this question of the effects of immigrants and even the children of immigrants on the state, federal, local, all put together government budgets. And so I just don't think it's accurate to make the conclusion that Simon is drawing from this foreign data, European countries. I agree. There is a point where, look, if you are New York City and you decide, I'm going to put up in a hotel room anyone who shows up in the city, yeah, those people are very negative for the country and for society overall, and certainly for New York City in terms of their fiscal effects. They shouldn't do that. That was a bad policy. I'm glad it's done, mostly done anyway. and I wouldn't recommend it. But that is the result of actions taken by the New York City government, not anything to do with the immigrants. We should have a policy where we build a wall around the welfare state. We've done a lot of work on that. I wish nativists would actually come and work with us to try to get Republicans to, restrict welfare for immigrants as opposed to looking to just ban everyone and deport them, which is very costly endeavor in and of itself. So that's my general response. Mamdani, look, I can cite Simon. He's a great, defender of freedom. Mamdani, he's not. There's going to be exceptions. Look who he was running against. I mean, he was running against this unbelievably corrupt, a person who was running these hotel socialism, like literally the worst policy that I could possibly think of. He was running. So the competition wasn't really a fair fight, unfortunately. But if you look at the whole, New York City governance today is much better than it was 30, 40 years ago when people were fleeing New York City in droves. Immigrants have overall improved the governance of New York City as opposed to destroying the city like some predicted. No, it actually brought back the city and revived many of the areas that were depressed as people fled the very poor governance of the 1980s and early 1990s.
Simon, please respond to that, and then I have a follow-up for Simon.
Yeah, I'm actually not going to argue with everything David said. And the last part, one of the reasons why New York City got out of the 70s, and I remember it. I used to go to Times Square sometimes to watch Kung Fu movies with my dad while he was at the New York Public Library doing work. It was raw. It was pretty rough. There were hookers everywhere, and there was garbage everywhere, and rats. And when you had a blackout, you better lock your stuff up because you're going to get robbed. But a lot of immigrants came to New York and they bought houses, maybe one at a time, and then they rented them out and they made a little bit of money off that, and it became a ladder for particularly Asians, but people from all countries to progress into the middle class, which is what America's always done. Unfortunately, Mayor Mamdani doesn't like capitalism, and so he's going to use rent controls so that those people can't actually make a living by renting out their houses, and he's killing the golden goose in the city that is the heart of capitalism in the United States, and that everybody sees as a symbol of the American dream and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. So I think in terms of governance, between him, Cuomo, I love Curtis Sliwa, but I don't think he had a hope. It's an absolute disaster for this great city of New York. And sorry, what was the actual question?
And, well, my follow-up is, okay, we've discussed the downsides or potential foreseeable downsides of having a diverse society and different groups competing for control of the state. David mentioned the importance of the Constitution and the importance of institutions. When it comes to the potential downsides of a society that does not embrace immigration, couldn't it be the case that society sees itself as all on the same page with the government and the government representing the people and people blindly trusting the government, leading to, I don't know, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, American Civil Wars, the First World War, the Second World War, the New Deal, the War on Poverty? All of those were done absent immigrants coming here and subjecting us to their tyranny. It was actually potentially a lack of immigration where people just assumed we're all one society, we're all looking after each other, sure, let the government do whatever they want. Couldn't a lack of immigration increase the decrease the amount of freedom and increase the lack of civilization that we actually have?
Yeah, I don't tie those things together. I think, it all depends on the speed with which immigrants assimilate. So let's look at, Indians are coming in thick and fast. There's like 5 million in the diaspora. But you've got people like Vivek Ramaswamy and I forget his name now, but there are quite a few conservative, right-wing people of Indian heritage. And then you've got Pramila Jayapal and Ro Khanna, who brought with them the Indian, communist or socialist tradition. So they, I would say, are pretty assimilated, that second or third generation, where some of them are on the right, some are on the left. That's what should happen. If you look at Italians, Irish, French, British, all of the previous groups who came here, Jews from Eastern Europe, they have assimilated in that way. You've got, far left Jewish Americans and you've got far-right Jewish Americans, and you've got some who are in the middle. But it takes time and it takes education. And when you have a lump of people in a particular place, you can end up with assimilation basically frozen in its tracks. People who've been here 30, 40 years don't speak any English. People who can become citizens without speaking a lick of English, which I think is an incredibly stupid idea. There are a few exceptions for people who are mentally retarded, or they have some inability to learn a language. But most people should be capable of learning the language of the country in which they live. At one point I spoke 5 languages, but I'm down to kind of 2.5 now. I think the biggest threat, though, is that we don't all play by the same rules. And I'll give you an example. This church break-in in Minneapolis. Now, I understand people who don't want immigration enforcement. I don't agree, but I understand their point of view. But there are rules, there are laws, and if you invade someone else's private property and you're asked to leave, then you are breaking trespassing and all kinds of state rules, state laws, in addition to the federal FACE Act. Now, it's pretty clear that Keith Ellison, the Attorney General in Minnesota, would not prosecute people on the conservative side, or on the left, rather, who were breaking those state rules. We have Larry Krasner in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, who said, even though he, I think, did not prosecute something like 65% of cases that were brought to him by the police, where they had some evidence, because he just didn't want to, he philosophically objects to prosecuting people. He said he's going to go after federal agents who are carrying out federal laws at the direction of the executive based on laws passed by Congress, whether or not you like those laws. So that worries me a lot more. We need to have judges who, even if they don't like it, are willing to look at the law and decide how it applies and make those decisions. And then it's up to the electorate to change Congress and get Congress to vote different laws in. But where we're going to break down is if we're going to have different laws in different places, like in parts of Europe, where a teacher was beheaded because he was trying to teach a class and it involved a pictorial depiction of something to do with the Mohammedan religion. I don't remember the exact specifics, but it offended enough people in that community, he ended up losing his life. That has happened a lot in Western Europe. It's happening even more in the United Kingdom. There are parts of cities where the national law simply doesn't apply anymore. And that's what I worry about happening here, is that we will have a nullification crisis, not state by state like we had in 1832 and 1861, but state by state, town by town. We'll just be saying, nope, this doesn't work for us. We don't want to obey this rule. It'll be like, the Branch Davidians out in Waco, Texas in 93, or the MOVE unit of Back to Africa people in the 80s in Philadelphia, or the sovereign citizen movement out in wherever it is, Idaho, who say, yeah, federal law doesn't apply to us. Well, if it's only a few clowns in a few places, we can survive that. But when it's whole cities and whole states, we're in trouble.
David, would increasing the amount of immigration or keeping it at its current level decrease the amount of unification of rules, creating more hostility than there otherwise would be?
Look, our entire country is based on the premise of different rules in different places. That's the federalist system of government. And you look at Madison's, Federalist Paper number 10, I mean, he's talking about, yeah, we want to have a country of diversity where you have different groups all checking each other to prevent tyranny. The fact that, no single faction could get a majority and impose its will on everyone else was a feature, not a bug of the Federalist and constitutional order that Madison and his fellow Federalists were arguing for. So I completely don't understand the idea that we wouldn't want to have a society with pluralistic rules. You can only look at, you cite a bunch of kooky weirdos who never had any serious political power and were repudiated by basically everyone. I don't see any evidence that immigrants are coming here and taking over our society and fundamentally transforming it in a negative way. Some people buy into that, accept that, but there's not any good evidence. if you look, again, New York City is a good example. The governance of New York City is much better than it was in the 70s when we didn't have all these immigrants who came. Of course, you know, it's always been an immigrant city, but the different immigrants, the ones that are scary and, you know, we need to fret about today, whereas we didn't fret about the Italians. Of course, we fretted about the Italians and others who came to New York City in the past. But at its basic point, I think we need to take a step back and say, look at what the reality is in the United States. And the reality is people are assimilating faster than they were even in the late 19th and early 20th century. They're learning English faster. They're arriving now. If you look at the number of people who arrive, who have some experience with democracy in their home countries, it's over 70% of all the immigrants come, they have some experience with democracy. In the late 19th century, it was basically flipped the other way, where it was, 70% had no experience. They were from absolute tyrannies. And so we have more pre-assimilation. We have more people who basically understand what's going on here with this government. And the assimilation happens rapidly in terms of political beliefs, in terms of language assimilation. By the second generation, basically everyone knows English by the second generation. This whole idea that there's going to be these enclaves where they're going to take over and no one's ever going to assimilate just hasn't worked out that way. And they haven't imported, these negative norms and destructive tendencies that we've seen. I mean, we mentioned the welfare fraud in Minnesota. Yeah, that's a terrible case. It's possible that the Somalis are one outlier group that have a higher percentage there. But overall, if you look at the best data that we have comes from the U.S. Sentencing Commission. I've analyzed it for Cato. And if you look at that, the rate of welfare fraud and the losses attributed to non-citizens is much lower than it is for the U.S. Citizen population, which is good evidence that the immigrants aren't coming here and defrauding us of all of our welfare.
Oh, do you mind if I respond to a couple of those?
Please do.
Well, the last one, yeah, of course, the welfare fraud by native Minnesotans is higher because there's only 80,000 Somalis. I don't know what percentage that is of the state, but it's not a large one. So, something like out of 90 people arrested for fraud, 83 of them were Somalis. So I think you could say they're overrepresented in that particular scam. That does not mean that other Americans don't rip off welfare. And CIS was reporting that about 90% of Somalis who have children in Minnesota use some kind of federal welfare, which is well above the average for people who are born in Minnesota. Their average wage is like $38,000 a year versus $80,000. I could go on. When you compare New York City to the 1970s, I'm interested that you always go back to the 70s when it sucked and not to 2000 when it was actually doing pretty good. So it seems like New York City has to get really, really bad before it gets to improve. But if you compared it to 2000, I think you'd find people would say that it was not necessarily better. When you talk about people being more prepared and learning English, I'll give you a perfect example of that not being the case. There's evidence of recipients of DACA, the Obama-era deferred action of childhood arrivals, where some of these kids who've been here pretty much all their lives, are now adults, are extremely uneducated and do not speak functional English, a high percentage. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the poster child for open borders. This is the guy from the Maryland man who the Trump administration has been trying to deport, who was allegedly a member of MS-13, who was caught with a van full of people from the border of unknown origin in Tennessee that he was taking presumably to a job site in Maryland. I heard him speak on multiple occasions. He went to public schools in Maryland. I think he got here when he was like 12, and he's now pushing 30. This guy does not speak functional English. So something in the assimilation pipeline is not working. And I'm not saying that it never happened in the past. I'm sure there were enclaves in big cities where people were able to preserve their culture. But I think it comes down to numbers. If you have a Hispanic population, for example, that is 100% of an area, then where's the incentive for them to learn English? Maybe when their kids go out to go to college or join the military, it'll happen maybe 2-3 generations down the line. But in the short term, there's almost zero impetus for that to happen.
Kilmar Abreu
All right.
Garcia arrived when he was 16, and it's pretty representative of, late arrival with low education. Yeah, he's probably not going to learn English. How big of a problem is that? I mean,
in his whole life,
I don't expect. We didn't expect Italians and Germans to immediately know English when they got off the boat. And
not immediately, no.
By the second generation, many of them were learning English, but actually the rate of English language acquisition among this Hispanic immigrant population is better than these groups in the early 20th century. So I just pulling out one example of one guy doesn't really represent what's generally happening with immigrants in the United States.
Simon, do immigrants commit a disproportionate, of course, your Somali example is taken, there's only 80,000. We're referring to per capita statistics here. Simon, do immigrants commit a disproportionate amount of violent crimes? Do you have any statistics on that?
Well, here's where David and I are going to get into the old saying, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. I think it was Benjamin Disraeli. I've not read his report yet, but already Twitter is abuzz with people challenging the methodology, because all the studies that show that immigrants commit fewer crimes than Americans are they have a couple basic flaws. One is that they confuse legal immigrants like myself with illegal immigrants. There's a difference. Two, they don't account for any other variables. Men commit way more crime than women. Young people commit way more crime than old people. People from certain countries, I mean, if you look at the European statistics on rape and sexual assault, Algerians, Afghans, certain countries have an incredible multiple of times of committing those offenses. Now, I would think that it's quite likely that a similar population would have similar results in the United States. That's partly because they skew young and male. They've come from countries where there are very different social customs. When you're looking broadly, in the United States, the claims that immigrants commit fewer crimes, like I say, they don't distinguish between legal and illegal immigrants. And they usually come back to this one study done in Texas that, and I won't bore listeners with all the reasons, but the Center for Immigration Studies and others kind of cracked it open and looked at the numbers behind it. It doesn't account for a lot of important variables, such as whether or not the person that the study was able to account for each individual's criminal record. In other words, they didn't always know because the data hadn't got to the prison. It hadn't been recorded yet at the time when they did the study. In any case, I would agree that the average rate of crime committed by immigrants, legal and illegal, is probably no higher than that of American citizens. But when you break it down by country, say Venezuela, Afghanistan, by age, by ethnic group, if you split it in those ways and analyze the data, you would find that there were certain countries, certain groups, certain ages who had wildly disproportionate levels of crime, even though on average you probably would find the rates not all that dissimilar. And when you accounted for variables like age, the average American, white American, for example, is like 55 years old, whereas the average black American is like 28 years old. So that is a huge variable when you're talking about crime. And it has an impact in the data. And if you don't account for that variable, then the results look skewed.
Okay, I was offended on both counts, insulting men and people in the young demographic. Okay, I'll have to contact the Southern Poverty Law Center immediately. David,
I want to get on their list.
That's a badge of honor. David, do immigrants commit a disproportionate amount of violent crime?
No, absolutely not. And we have this broken down a number of different ways. We referenced the Texas data. We went back and looked at just homicides because those are so thoroughly investigated that there's not ambiguity there. We know who the homicide people being convicted of homicide are. Texas is investigating their legal status every time. There's no question, and they're significantly less likely to have been convicted of homicide in the state of Texas. Again, a state pretty representative of the country, actually higher than a normal immigrant population share there. So we have arrest and conviction records for the most serious violent crime in the state of Texas that bears out this relationship. The other thing we have is, if you look at our prisons, we know who's in our prisons from the U.S. Census Bureau. They look at who is in our prisons. Overwhelming 96% or so of the people in prison have committed a felony. So these are not small time people. Most of them are violent offenders. There are a lot of there's a lot of people in our prisons. So I don't want to say there's no nonviolent offenders in there, but a majority of them are violent offenders. And if you look at that population, immigrants are about 70% less likely to be in our prisons in the most recent data that we have. And so it's not like a small difference. Like, these are enormous differences, and there's different reasons for it. One is we vet people at entry, so the legal immigrant population does have a lower rate of committing crimes. I'm for legal immigration. I want everyone to come here and be vetted before they get here. I want 100% of all of ICE agents and Border Patrol and all of our government apparatus to be focused on preventing violent criminals from coming here in the first place and being deported if they come here illegally. That's not what our immigration system does. The vast majority of it is focused on matters that have nothing to do with national security or physical security or public safety. This has nothing. You look at what the things that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services are spending billions of immigrant fees on investigating. It's things like the difference between extraordinary ability and merely exceptional ability. We need to really figure out who's exceptional and who's extraordinary and who's merely exceptional. And they're spending billions of dollars on questions like that instead of doing investigations into violent crime. So I would have all of our resources be devoted to this question. So we have arrest records, we have incarceration records. We also have the survey of violent victimization of the victims. So we can talk to the victims and say, who victimized you? And the immigrant population, again, it's about 70% less likely to be a victim of violent crime by someone they know. And so the people they know are largely or much more likely to be other immigrants. And so we have it from the arrest records in Texas, we have it from the prisons, we have it from the victims themselves. So there's a lot of different lines of evidence here coming together to produce the same result, that immigrants are much less likely to be committing the types of crimes that we should be seriously worried about. But even if it was different, even if it was not that way and immigrants were more likely to be committing crime, I would still say all of our law enforcement should be focused on those criminal elements and trying to deport them, rather than trying to regulate who works a construction job and who advertises their services outside of Home Depot, or do all the racial profiling that the Trump administration is doing out on the streets right now.
So Simon, what about that point? The concept that focusing on who technically does not have the papers to be here, all of those law enforcement opportunity costs and monetary costs are misallocated away from prosecuting actual violent crime, rape, theft, murder, burglary. Couldn't that be one of the downsides of advocating immigration controls? You misallocate scarce resources toward less desirable ends?
Well, let's be clear. I dispute David's numbers, and there are smarter people than me who've crunched the numbers who dispute them with more credibility and evidence. But the studies that I've read, 70%, I don't buy that. But let's just stipulate. Let's say it's true that, now, again, he's always conflating legal immigrants with illegal. We're not worried about the legal immigrants because they have at least gone through some vetting. And I'll talk about that in a second. We're worried about the illegal immigrants. So I want to know the comparison between illegal immigrants and American citizens. That's an interesting comparison. We have a preventable crime map that we haven't really had time to keep up with because there's so many different crimes happening, that just shows a few of the many, many, many American citizens who've had their lives ruined, and sometimes immigrants who've had their lives ruined by someone who never should have been here in the first place. So that's the bottom line is, you're saying Well, we should wait until these people get here, commit a crime, and then worry about deporting them rather than just keeping them out in the first place. When the thing that David said that is the least true is that we vet people. That is bullshit. I have been a consular officer for 23 years. I've done 50 to 100,000 visa interviews. And I also have been to the border 5 times, and I've seen people coming across from India, Africa, 30 countries on one night in Yuma, Arizona. So I think it's something like 175, almost every country on earth. During the Biden administration, they were brought in at the border. They were released. We took their fingerprints probably and ran their photo and their name, which might not have been true, and their birthday that they gave us because they had no documents in most cases. We ran it through our systems, NC, III, and the FBI maintained database. So if they had a criminal record in North Carolina or Virginia, we would have known about it. But if they were a murderer back home in Ecuador or in Peru, or a member of MS-13, or a Russian mobster, or a member of a criminal syndicate in Punjab, we had no idea. So there was zero vetting. I call it 9-0, nothing in, nothing out. If you ping a database that has no information in it, the result will always be, this guy's good to go. So no, I recently wrote a report about vetting of Afghans brought into the United States, and I go into a lot of detail about how this actually works. There was almost zero vetting of all of the people who were brought in under parole or who were released at the border. No credible vetting. If they had criminal records back home in Ghana or in Yemen or in Somalia, we did not know it. And some of them did. Probably not a high percentage, but let's say it was the similar percentage as in the U.S. 5 murders out of 100,000. Or in the south side of Chicago, 65 murders out of 100,000. That's a lot of future murders and rapes and crimes that we're going to have to deal with. So the one thing I do agree with David on, and I like to always end on a positive note, is that we do need to reform our non-immigrant visa system. I agree with him. The rules on O1 visas, L visas, H's are far too complicated. I would restrict and simplify, have a cap, have a limit, and if they met certain thresholds, I don't care whether you're an opera singer or a keyboard juggler, and David would have no limits at all. But we do agree the present system is unnecessarily complicated.
One final question for each of you gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everyone for watching Zero Hedge Debates, of course. David, what is the most misunderstood aspect of your position on immigration?
I think the most misunderstood is just what we just heard, that I'm defending illegal immigration. No, I want immigration to be legal. I want that vetting to happen. That's not happening. As I pointed out, we're spending all this time on other things. And so I think the fundamental misunderstanding is that the people defending immigrants and saying they're generally a positive thing just don't care about security and don't care about legality. It's just the opposite. I want a legal and orderly system where people have certainty. They can show up, they get vetted, they actually get vetted, they get screened, they can come into the United States, they can line up a job in advance, they can line up housing in advance. I don't want chaos at the border. I don't want illegal immigration. I want legal immigration. And that really, I think, separates me from everyone who just wants closed borders, because really what they're saying is we want the immigration to continue to be illegal.
Simon, what is the most misunderstood aspect of your position?
Well, these days, Hollywood and activists somehow have this idea that immigration enforcement is cruel and unjust and illegal, and that this government is tyrannical because they're trying to carry out laws that were passed by Congress. There used to be an agreement on both parties that even if we wanted to change the law, we had to enforce it. And if you don't enforce laws, if you have a speed limit of 55 and you let people drive 155 and no one ever gets arrested, you have no speed limit. It's a joke. It's like laws in many of the countries I've lived that say, no littering or red light. People ignore them because they know they're not going to get caught. If we set limits on immigration, and I respect that David wants no limits, I want limits. I don't want zero, but I want limits. But if we set those limits, if Congress passes laws, and then those laws have provisions to expel people who break them, then we have to carry that out, or else the system is a joke. If we decide not to enforce interior immigration law, we are sending the signal to the entire world that just like under the Biden administration, you can come to our country either on a plane or at the border, and you will get in and you will never be removed. And that essentially means open borders. So that's the choice we have. We either have open borders, no rules and no limits on immigration, and just a kabuki theater of pretending we're enforcing rules by making people show up for hearings and then not deporting them at the end of those hearings, or we have a rule of law and we have a system that functions, and if people are deemed deportable by an immigration judge after due process, then they can be deported.
Thank you to everyone for watching the Zero Hedge debate series on immigration. David and Simon, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time.
Thanks,
you.
Keith.
Appreciate it.